Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for a few more folks to join. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are for joining in. Welcome to Cloud Institute's How to Cut Cloud Costs in 2022 using FinOps. I will be your host, Zaki Medina. A little about me. A little about Cloud Institute. We are a results-driven cloud coaching training platform where you can develop sort of the skills validation around your cloud skills. So it doesn't matter whether you're starting your journey in cloud or you're an experienced practitioner of cloud, you've come to the right place. At Cloud Institute, we take you to the next level around your cloud training needs. And I myself am Zaki Medina. I'm sort of been a multi-cloud solution architect working on both AWS, Azure, and GCP. I hold multiple certifications in all three cloud, three main cloud providers. I've also had the privilege of leading several teams around their migration to cloud. The last 8 to 9 years, I've been focused on AI and blockchain technologies as well as marketplaces and leveraging cloud for those types of workloads and so on. So that's sort of the quick background. And today's topic is kind of near and dear to me. One thing that doesn't show up on my initial brief is I started my career as an accountant. So I started on the cost side, and the joke is started by looking at spreadsheets, and then went into IT for 20 years, and then in machine learning, I went back to looking at spreadsheets because Excel is a great 2D data analysis tool. So I've come full circle, you could say. But the thing around FinOps is really critical. And now we're going to talk about what FinOps is here in a minute, but really it's around cost optimization, right? And I've been in this space for about, at least for the last 10 years, what I've seen, there's a lot of massive companies around the world are having this challenge in understanding how do I allocate cloud costs and how do I do that efficiently? And that's really what we're going to discuss today and talk about, right? We're going to talk about, what and the why of FinOps, especially now in 2022 with the situation, the macroeconomic situation that's being presented, as well as we'll look at some of the things around, how do I create the right type of licensing model, the right type of resource provisioning and consumption with FinOps in mind, and also how do I validate and manage my bills, right? Especially multi-cloud, right? If I have multi-cloud, how do I manage that multi-cloud environment? So we'll even look at an example of a tool as well, and then we sort of start the discussion around principle of FinOps from a very high level. Again, this is 1 hour webinar. Is very expansive in terms of trying to, we're not trying to boil the entire ocean of FinOps because it's a huge topic. We're trying to be cloud agnostic here, but I will bring up examples from AWS, from Azure, from GCP. And for those folks that are interested in something a little more advanced, a bit more deep dive in either one of these clouds, feel free to shoot us a comment, right? Hey, what content you would like to see, especially around FinOps in the future. We're looking at our planning for 2023. Be really helpful to get that. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And at any given time, feel free to jump in and ask a question. I mean, put a question in your comments. I will monitoring that as well. The comments button as well, so we can have a look there. So as I mentioned, cloud and FinOps really come together around these two specific challenges, and the challenges is ultimately around. Sorry, jumping ahead here, is really around. The first is the introduction of DevOps, which really brought really fast delivery of software, right? And infrastructure as a code, and then combining those together with cloud, basically we've given engineers sort of a free rein, a free handle, sort of a no constraints to get to resources. And then as a result of these things really broke traditional procurement channels within technology in the last few years, right? And it's basically completely transformed the way IT has been procured. You know, I was actually sitting in a room with a bunch of CIOs last month, and they were all coming out and talking about the world of, how do we control spending in the world where engineers and developers now have complete control to spend company money at will. And what's even more complicated is that, you know is what they're doing with code. They're not really even knowing how they're doing it. Like, you're just clicking a few buttons. It's kind of like, myself when I'm, in Amazon Prime overload mode, where I'm just clicking next, 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 one, next day shipping, or same day shipping, that kind of thing. So this one button to click has transformed the way procurement has happened, right? And so this is what we talk about when we talk about the rise of the cloud economy. So, basically we understand that, hey, software is eating the world, right? And developers and, and engineers are sort of spinning up infrastructure, auto scaling it. And, there's all kinds of things that we're seeing. But, how do we go about solving this, right? So one of the things is, historically, if we look at the past, right? If we look at how at the past, most of the spending in the past was all capex related, right? So there was capex spending, and that's capital expenditures that were made in long 3 to 5 year depreciation cycles, and that was really the accounting point, right? So now that was very interesting about data center world. The costs were all fixed, right? Back in the old on-premise world, you knew it was good and bad. You could argue you knew exactly what you were going to spend, wasn't variable. You couldn't, but the thing was, you didn't lack you we lacked flexibility, and so on. But then in the early 2000s, we started seeing these web companies, web 2.0 companies coming up, even companies like Amazon itself and eBay and all these. For them, it became very important in their journey that they be able to deploy infrastructure as soon as possible, right? And so that's when 2006, that's sort of where Amazon through AWS, Amazon Web Services, launched EC2. That completely changed the dynamic. And that's basically where we got coupled to what you could say the rise of Agile and DevOps. And now we end up in a world where a majority of companies that I'm talking to are really heading to the cloud first, and they're aspiring to be cloud first as much as they are. Yeah, granted, there are still some big enterprises that have a bunch of hybrid cloud, and they still have some things in the data center. That's really a matter of time before they eventually move that to the cloud. And what's notable about the cloud is that once you move to the cloud, you're essentially moving from a capex to an opex spending model, right? So now your operational expenditures, the way which companies need to account to their IT, has changed. We've now moved into what is called a variable cost model, right? Which means you pay for what you use and you don't pay for what you don't use. But this is also transferred accountability down to engineering teams. And oftentimes we don't really look at sort of the behavioral change, right? And so if we look now, and this is a number that I've recently gone through. Gartner talks about, the public cloud spend in 2022 is close to 500 billion this year, right? In fact, a couple of years ago, it was 360 billion. That was actually the predicted cloud spend in 2022, but obviously didn't take into account the whole planet going under house arrest thanks to the pandemic and everyone working from home, and how that basically supercharged the cloud, and so on. So this is kind of amazing when you think about historically how this looks. And so, you know, jumping in to sort of how traditionally we've looked at, when you look at a traditional model, right? Let's look historically how engineering teams, how platform teams got resources, right? So they have a project, they want to go do some planning, probably do some capacity planning about what sort of infrastructure they need, and they look at sort of 3 to 5 year window to accounting. Sure, if you're a work for a retailer, you'll know you'll get your Black Friday spikes or high, holiday season shopping. So there will be some high volume periods that are very seasonal in nature, and that applies to a lot of industries across and a lot of verticals. Basically, you'd have those teams go back to procurement. In this case, procurement was a very important arm, and they sort of govern the spend and making sure that they're paying the right amount, they're getting the right services, getting the right contracts in place. And you'll always have a procurement manager that will always do their job and due diligence to make sure that, hey, every year we make sure our costs are aligned, we're not increasing costs, we're in line with inflation, and they'll put pressure on the vendors, on the suppliers to make sure they receive any kind of pricing advantage as a result of economies of scale and things like that, right? So that was great. But now what's happened is in this model, you kind of had, if we just dissect this model, you kind of had engineers as sort of, you know, in this traditional, you can call it technology consumption model, we had engineering teams and finance teams sort of being a check and balance system together, right? So engineers would request and finance would have to approve. As we mentioned, spend is very predictable and static, but then it takes a long time to get new technology. That was also the downside. So now what meant was you had a high cost of failure. More importantly, it was not easy to innovate. And this was becoming really hard, if we, let's say, had a new product idea. And so we want to spin up something really quickly and see how it's going to work. It it couldn't be even harder. Like companies would basically have to create their own sandbox environment, and then it becomes sort of like who's who. There's some favoritism, which group gets to use the sandbox environment to prototype their ideas and things like this. And now imagine, this is Fortune 500 companies who are running thousands of different workloads in multiple data centers around the world and so on. And this was really necessary for procurement. Now, like fast forward now to cloud. Now, cloud comes in and sort of, introduces a completely different model for the team, right? And cloud basically gives these the platform teams, the service teams, the IT team, the ability to go and start spinning up these resources, and they end up basically now we're in a world where they go straight to the provider. There's no procurement, middle person, right? A procurement is essentially largely out of the loop and out of the conversation. In fact, their role has changed. If we're going to buy this stuff, you've already bought it. Procurement is just going to try to figure out how to get the best deal right now, right? Maybe that's discounting programs through commitments through cloud providers, etc. So in that model, we've talked about how engineers are spending money very dynamically and much more less predictive, right? And this can be both a good thing and a bad thing. But I would say the really good thing here is that now you're able to enable agile experimentation, right? So agile required this, right? And so you can, everything has a pro and con, right? You got to balance everything. So, we're going to go using the agile mindset. We're going to go and try things. Engineers can go and try things without waiting for many months of hardware to come in. And we can just spin this up. So for most companies, what we find is that the DevOps team are already doing this, and the finance teams and procurement teams are really trying to clean up after them. But they're not really talking, right? In fact, there's a lack of communication as part of this. And that's why a lot of you are here today. Maybe you're on the DevOps side or the tech side, maybe on the finance side, you're frustration. You want to understand, hey, how can we move together forward? And that's where we're here to discuss today. So, so these companies tend to sort of, find themselves in this new reality today, right? And so there's a lack of communication and so on. And so, one of the things that's coming up is this. You can, these companies basically come across this sort of new reality. You could say, the first one is decentralization, right? Now, a lot of companies that I've talked to over the years, they mention something like, hey, we're running 1,000 of different workloads. There's potentially hundreds of different product teams. We're now responsible for that IT spending. And the cloud spend itself has really gotten material. We mentioned that $500 billion number from Gartner, but we're actually starting to see some individual companies themselves who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars with a single cloud provider in a single year, right? So, the numbers are getting really material. When in the past they just weren't big enough. And so, we mentioned that, hey, we're now moving from fixed to variable as a result of this. And we're actually seeing a lot of inefficiency. And a lot of companies are really looking at this and saying, okay, how can we make sure that we tighten this up? So this is, so on the back of this is where FinOps came to be. And I would say I've watched FinOps sort of grow as a concept and evolve over the years from being more than just call out optimization, more than cloud financial management. FinOps is, or financial operations, become more of a term that's now gelling. And regardless of what you call it, it's really about bringing financial accountability to the variable cloud spends that happen today. So essentially, it's really a set of things. If you think about it, it's really a prescriptive set of actions on how to manage cloud, allocate it, get visibility into it. And it's really, you can argue that these are sort of best practices we should follow, but sometimes it doesn't get transmitted. Maybe not, maybe for one team it does, but not for all teams in the same organization. And maybe that's where this has to be looked at as a larger cultural shift, right? And so we really have to look at this from a holistic perspective and address it, like where you have product teams, engineering, finance, and business teams historically that didn't really work well together that have to come together, and so on. So that's really sort of the crux of the issue, right? So FinOps really is going to help us bring this financial accountability, as we said, right? And in fact, the most important one here, um, I would say, is that FinOps is not there to help you save money or spend less. Maybe that's a consequence of what it does, or an outcome of one of the outputs of it, but it's really there to drive business value, right? So how do we give a framework for these teams to go drive business value in this cloud economy? And that's really the whole FinOps model, right? You've got this whole, notion of a team, coming in, you know, and sort of, you basically now are bringing both these teams. They're working well together. They're acting as one, and so engineering teams are able to both be able to both get what they really need quickly, and the finance and procurement teams are able to, have the ability to make sure that they get, they're getting the best deal on that, right? And then the cost of failure can create either a weak link, or I would say it will greatly reduce, maybe enable these teams to move faster. But then, we just want to achieve the right type of balance, right? Maybe there's a fast enough approach, right? And so, a lot of people are looking at this space, and they're even talking about things like green cost optimization and things like this. What does that mean? It's not just about optimizing cost, but it's really bringing all these things together, right? It's educating teams, it's putting automation reporting, it's striving for collaboration, it's getting all these pieces together, right? And so that's sort of will give us the crux on how to build approach FinOps, right? It's really bringing everybody together, right, and driving business value. And I think as a consequence of that business value, yes, you'll have cost savings. You'll be able to run things more efficiently. That's the thing. So what I want to do is I want to jump in sort of a topic, around managing licenses. So we've picked up a few major topics. This topic is huge, by the way. You could literally have like a 5-day class, 9 to 5, just sit here and talk about FinOps from ground up and all the way up. And you can do it for each of the different cloud providers, CSPs out there as well. But we just thought we'd pick sort of the very paramount topics, and run with that. So starting with licenses, right? We know licenses are important. Whenever you're building and running a data center in public clouds, right, versus the traditional way, right? That costs money. And one of the ways you want to think about is cost control to some degree. And so the major thing around cost control is how do I manage the licensing, right? So let's jump in. So again, if you have questions for me, feel free to add those in. So I have to first go back to sort of, the types of different licensing environments, right? So how does a lot of us, get started in our journey to public cloud, right? We actually simply, just pull out a credit card, right? That's the first thing that they do is, if you're a person that wants to try some technology in the public cloud, great, you can just pull up a card. What if you're an enterprise? Obviously, it's not the same way, right? Enterprises quite, they have very large, massive environments that are hosted in the cloud. And therefore, it's very advisable to have agreements with cloud providers, right? Examples of cloud providers are AWS, Azure, GCP, right? So, and that's basically, you want to ensure, the enterprise wants to ensure that they are getting the best financial offer, and they're getting a safeguard on some of the service levels, right? So those are the two main reasons to obtain a license agreement, right? And so, you've got financial benefits in the long run, and the service level agreements. And then these license agreements actually are very complicated. But in a sense, you can distill it down to really three types of agreements. You've got your consumption-based one, you've got your commitment-based, and you've got sort of your, limited agreement. So we'll go through each one of these. So when I mean by consumption-based, this is often what a lot of people are familiar with in the cloud. It's your pay-as-you-go model. The enterprise only pays for the actual usage of the public cloud without any upfront commitment. So cloud providers essentially issue a monthly invoice with the actual consumption of resources. So these resources, for example, virtual machines, database instances, storage units, they're all charged against the rates that are published on the public portals of those various cloud service providers, right? Great. Now, the next one is commitment based. And this is sort of more very common for a lot of enterprises, right? In fact, this is the most common version where basically a company or enterprise, they actually commit to a usage of a specified amount of of those resources in the cloud for a period of time. And typically this is 1 year, 3 year, 5 years. In certain cases, I've even seen longer than that, 5 years. I've even seen 7 years. So and those are special ones. So public clouds, like GCP, Azure, and AWS, right? They're sort of invented to ensure maximum flexibility and agility, right? Now, if we allow enterprises to have committed resources for a longer period of time, then this will have an impact on the resources that a public cloud can offer to other customers. And for that reason, public cloud providers want to always be certain that the enterprises do really commit on the consumption of these reserved resources, right? So typically, an enterprise will need to pay upfront for these resources, whether they use them or not. And then cloud consumption in this case becomes sort of this formal contract that entitles an enterprise to have these resources available at all times, right? So there's, to make sure there's continuity of service, no disruption, eh, yada, yada, yada. So that's really, really important for enterprises. The next one is sort of, limited agreements. These are agreements that are limited by time. And, it's usually to the amount of resources that our customers can use. Typically, these are type of agreements that are really used for trial periods where resources are not charged for a specific period of time. Well, not all services will be part of these agreements, right? So you could have a situation where you have a really heavy instance, compute instance. Maybe it's running a lot of memory, a lot of terabytes of storage. Maybe after 1 to 2 or 3 months, that environment will be suspended by a cloud provider. Basically, the limited agreement can also hold a certain amount of credits to ensure that, if the credit amount is used, the trial period ends, right? So those are some examples. So the whole goal about this is to really understand how, these are the structures of the agreement. These are the constraints or the parameters in which we build our components. Now, sorry, apologies, the pictures didn't come through on my slide here. So software licenses and cloud platforms. When the enterprise, basically when any enterprise that uses software is going to need to purchase licenses for its usage, right? Whether it's proprietary or open source to some degree, even if it's open source, you're still hiring people, so you're incurring a cost, right? So the main difference between the categories of open source software is it allows you for some modifications and changes in the software as long as the changes are contributed to the software development as a whole. But at the same time, you're now dependent on the individuals making those changes and so on. And then proprietary software is typically closed source code, and that source code cannot be modified, right? And so on. So as with licenses, software licenses, this is quite complicated. If a company uses a product and it's not sufficiently licensed, the company may be forced to pay fines along with those license fees should actually have paid from the start. So using non-licensed software is illegal, by the way. Definitely saying don't use it, but it doesn't change the fact, it doesn't change when we're moving environments to the cloud. So how do you know if a software product is properly licensed? There's just a few types of licenses out there, but I'm just sort of stripped them down to these couple of categories here. You have your license on a user basis, right? This is a very straightforward one, right? This is often the model as used. You see when you go online to any SaaS-based product, it's for end user licensing, right? And so it gives you a license. For instance, you could use a license for this product, StreamYard, and it's got a license per user per month. And basically, it's a one-to-one relationship between the user and the use of a specific software product. Then you have licenses based on resources. This is a little more complicated. Licensing, as an example, let's say you have software licenses based on the usage of the type of machine. Maybe it's dependent on the number of CPUs, the number of database instances. Now, this is still a very popular way of licensing proprietary software. you know who you are. Anyway, the license fee is calculated according to like how many CPUs or instances are used. Uh, Now, interestingly enough, the issue in cloud infrastructure is the resources are quite often shared resources, right? You kind of virtualize the top of the physical machine. Now, which CPU is licensed then? Question and an answer I've never received quite fully from cloud service providers. So it's typically the license in cloud environments is based on this concept or the synthetic concept of what is called a virtual CPU, right? So in this case, keep in mind that these support agreements and software might change as soon as the software is deployed in cloud environments, right? So not all software is supported, so you have to make sure that there's a compatibility with whatever you're using on premise over to a cloud service provider, right? As an example. And then the final one is kind of like the archaic way of how we've, the lump sum fee where software is purchased and paid a full upfront on. For software, this is actually a lose-lose situation for everyone, and I'll explain. So for software vendors, it's not very attractive. For once, they will only receive one-time payment, right? But for companies, this is also not very attractive since they're confronted with high upfront cash out investments, right? So basically, you're making an investment, and eventually you have to come up with these weird accounting rules for amortization or depreciation, and all of that for these licenses. And how do you really do that? No one knows. Even accountants struggle with this often. So, in the past, I've seen other, there's things like software asset management tools or SAM tools. They're very useful to basically, tell you, if the software product is properly licensed. SAM tools will basically do a quick inventory of all the software that a company uses, and you can use these solutions to look after the whole life cycle of your software from purchase to deployment and utilization. So it's very, very powerful. Like in the past, I used a tool. What was it? Some of you may have used BMC in the BMC world. They have this tool. I think it's called Remedy Asset Management. And then in ServiceNow, another tool. The SAM is part of what they have, the IT Operations Management module, right? ITOM module. So these are sort of the examples we have around that. So what we're going after right now is really understanding all the various components that go into our FinOps discussion, right? And then maybe later webinars, if you guys choose, if you want to dive in and see how they interact and overarch. But really the goal is to look at sort of the fundamental building blocks of FinOps, right? So we're obviously, license is a big piece, and and everybody knows the real cost of IT is around management, right? So especially when you have PaaS or platform as a service or software as a service software that we're running in our environments, right? What does that look like, right? So we're confronted by sort of, these two major challenges, right? The organizations is how do I what's the cost and how do I manage it, right? So cost and management become a really big piece. For costs, one of the key drivers, to move systems to cloud is that it's believed to be cheaper than keeping systems on premise. And that's not always the case, though a major cost factor is licenses and contracts to allow the usage of cloud services, especially when the companies make the mistake of thinking that, hey, maybe that existing license I have on my on-premise environment will also cover me in my cloud. How many of us has been, guilty of that, right? I know I have been, right? So, there's a reason why, we have to think about this, right? So if we run software on an on-premise environment, we can easily predict that the system will not change often, and the license will definitely cover the usage of the software. But in cloud environments, the systems will change and will change rapidly, even on an hourly basis. And because of that, because of the scaling and auto scaling back and forth, paying the cloud provider for license might be advantage for systems that are not run 24/7. So there could be, cost savings in stopping this systems and then and then negotiating an enterprise discount and so on. So all of those things come into major everything around that. The next thing around management, right? So I get it. It's a really cumbersome task to manage all these software licenses and contracts. So a lot of companies decide to outsource this, right? So for the cloud, this can be done either through a partner or reseller program or a cloud solution provider, a CSP. Now, cloud providers such as the ones we discussed, right? Like Azure, AWS, and Google, right? They often work with partners, right? And these partners or these they can either be either very large system integrators or very small companies that sort of specialize in a specific cloud service, right? So these partners are really entitled to resell services on cloud platforms. So in this case, the enterprise doesn't really purchase cloud services directly, but they do it through a partner and these hyperscalers, right? So these partners basically can acquire licenses for various cloud services on behalf of their customers, right? A big benefit of this model is that the company doesn't have to worry about licensing themselves. It will be taken care of by the CSP, right, who manage this completely. So to be clear, a CSP is not the same as a third party broker or reseller for software. A CSP really engages with their customer and will work on the cloud solutions jointly with the customers and the platform. So to make life easy, the CSP just takes care of all the licensing in the cloud too, right? So the customer is sure that all used services are covered with sort of the appropriate contracts. Now, a tip for you as someone I've worked for CSPs and I hired CSPs, always hire someone who really understands software licensing and knows how to negotiate tariffs, especially when your enterprise starts hitting big figures for consumption. Account managers for Microsoft, AWS, Google, VMware, any of these providers will gladly work with you to find the best solution, right? So, and now one of the things is that when you work, if you are working for software licenses, you can work with sort of third party broker, and something we'll cover later on. And there's this element called the application lifecycle management, or ALM, right? We'll talk a bit about that here coming up. Oops, sorry, I jumped right in. So essentially, one of the things when we're looking at sort of our account setup, right? When you're building out your enterprise, license model, whatever you choose, essentially your enterprises want a full overview of the total spend, right? And so we need to make sure that we can view the total spend from the top level all the way down to the subscriptions, right? We're just showing an example of the Azure model here, right? And sort of who owns what, right? Which subscriptions or which things are owned by specific business divisions or DevOps teams, right? And so these divisions or teams might have a full mandate to run their own subscriptions, but at the top level, at the enterprise level, we definitely want to see the overarching or the overall cost of these units that are accruing at the end of the day, right? So this starts with sort of setting up tenants, setting up the subscriptions and the accounts in the public cloud platforms, and this has to go following what is called a specific hierarchy, right? Now there's great news here for folks in the public cloud domain. A lot of the structures that you see in a public cloud will closely resemble sort of your typical chart of accounts, right? That you see in financial reporting, right? So, you know, I mean, it's really hard to tell, but if you have sort of someone from accounting and finance and they understand their organization chart of accounts, and you show them sort of the department build out, the subscription build out, they'll see, hey, I see a lot of charter accounts, meaning I have a thing under my accounting books that says sales or product development, and I see the same in subscriptions, on my cloud platform. So there could be a one-to-one. Not saying it should be, but sometimes there is, often not something like that. So so this is an example, right? So in Azure, the example we work with here, just showcasing, you start at the enterprise level, you want to enroll at the enterprise level. That's the top level where you can manage your entire enterprise administration, view all the usage across all the accounts in that Azure cloud environment. The next level is the departments. Beneath the departments, you can create accounts, and then and so on. So that's sort of what you want to do. Now, once you've created the accounts, then you can establish account owners who can view all of their subscriptions, and the account owners will have the rights to create subscriptions and appoint service administrators that can then manage the subscriptions, and so on. So this is the hierarchy we're showcasing here, right? And there's two different portals on which those things are done. Again, we can enroll multiple accounts. Similarly, in AWS, to manage them, AWS offers a service called AWS Organizations, where we can provision accounts using AWS CloudFormation and group them into organizational units, and then we can manage them from AWS organizations. Organizations also allow us to have a centralized cost management platform in AWS, and so on. So this is sort of the example here, right? So AWS really advises, you know, it's very interesting. AWS is able to, you know, do this kind of enterprise volume-driven discount program as well. It's called the EDP, or the Enterprise Discount Program. That would be part of the enterprise agreement with AWS. Um, you can do the same thing in GCP as well. Sorry, I went ahead. In GCP, and it's very similar to Azure in that, hey, we have a top level, utilization resource. The resource requires an organization node in GCP. We create that organization node through what is called cloud identity, and the node can then match the corporate internet domain. Now, beneath the organization node, you can view and manage every resource and account that is deployed under the organization, and so on. So, how the example we use here in Azure was the second level is departments. In GCP, it would be called folders, right? And so the final layer in the hierarchy in GCP is projects, right? So projects are functionally similar to subscriptions in Azure. Everything in GCP is created and managed through the Google Cloud Console or the G Cloud tool. In the console, we can create an organization ID, and whoever creates this ID is automatically assigned as a super administrator, right? So it's very critical you do it one time properly, and so on. So that's really what we're trying to get at is, once we have this good handle on how to build a top level, which is really needed from an enterprise administration perspective, where you have a single view or a single pane glass view of everything that's to be deployed in cloud environment, we're now in a better shape and form to understand how to, provision resources. That's the topic. Our next topic here is how do we go about building that resource here. Let me move to the next slide here. Okay, awesome. So essentially, we started looking at cost control, right? Cost control really starts with guidelines and principles on when and what type of resources we may need to be deployed and by whom. The way resources are deployed in different cloud platforms is very different, right? And there needs to be some kind of alignment when an enterprise adopts a multi-cloud strategy, especially around the shared language that gets deployed between the tech teams, right? So, we'll often discover that the resource planning becomes a very important element of that FinOps architecture, right? So we need to define what type of resources we're planning to provision and how we can deploy them using sort of the different methods in which. Again, we're not going to really focus today more on the methods, but I do want to talk a bit about like some of the key aspects, right? The first one is, and I've been guilty of this. There's this thing of Amex Armageddon, which is, it's not a term you're not familiar with. It's a term I see, and others have actually coined the term. When you see companies starting off in the public cloud, there's this great honeymoon period, and very often companies, even big ones, begin deploying resources in the public cloud without a plan. Basically, someone simply opens an account, gets a subscription, fills in some credit card details, and starts. And often the resources go unmonitored and they don't adhere to organizational mandates or any kind of policy. And then more, and more commonly, this is the term used. They call it shadow IT. And it's all right if you're a developer trying things out on a Saturday afternoon, but it's not okay if you're working for a company, a very large company with many, many thousands of workloads, right? And so what's funny is that Azure and AWS and GCP, although they said, yeah, great, we're making money, but we don't want to make it at the expense of our customers. We do want them to be responsible and so on, right? So it's kind of that little, when you look at gambling ads, they give you that little thing at the bottom that gamble responsibly, right? Cloud companies have basically put up what is called cloud adoption frameworks, or CAFs, right? So you've heard of CAFs, or some of you may have heard of CAFs. So if you're moving into a company to a public cloud, whether you're building a data center or shifting your on-premise environment into either GCP, AWS, or Azure, or any other cloud, the difference is the data center is essentially software defined. So as much with a physical data center, the virtual data center is the public cloud. It costs money, And if you're working without a plan, it will cost you more money than necessary, and probably also more than keeping applications in the physical data center. And so that's what I call Amex Armageddon, right? You want to have a plan. In most cases, we want to follow the CAF, right? That will provide guidelines on how to set up the business in the public cloud, how to build. And what's funny is that we've actually talked a bit about this to some degree in our past webinars. We talked about multi-cloud, how to accelerate your multi-cloud strategy, how to build the base ops as well as the landing zone, all of those things. So check out my other webinars at Cloud Institute where we do cover some of those elements. Essentially, it's how do we provision, whether it be virtual machines or containers, things like that, right? And what type of applications they'll be hosting. So if you're only planning to, let's say, as an example, every company needs a website. Sure, I want to deploy a website. Maybe I need to deploy big machines with lots of memory. Great. I now need to plan a host or physical hardware that has sort of the in-memory capability for that website or my ERP system or so on, right? So whatever that may be. Maybe I need 32 gigs of memory because it's a great big ERP system. The point is, it makes sense to have a plan and work out an architecture, right? Otherwise, we're going to be just going in circles with that. So in this chapter, one of the things we wanted to cover in this section is really how do we go about doing that. So a couple of things around the provisioning side I want to highlight is, when you're provisioning, before we dive into sort of cost control, when you're provisioning resources, really important to understand how resource provisioning works in public cloud, right? There's a lot of different ways to do this, right? Typically, you can either stick to native provisioning tools that either of the clouds provide. Like I know GCP has their native tool, Azure has their native tool, AWS has their native tool. And essentially, there's basically two types of provisioning. You have self-provisioning and dynamic, right? So typically, we start with self-provisioning because through the portal or web interface of a cloud provider, the customers basically choose the resources that are needed in the portal. And so after confirmation, then these resources can be deployed in the cloud environment, and the resources can then be spun up and made available for usage and so on. Now, these resources are either billed by the hour or minutes, unless there's a contract in place. And this is sort of the term you'll hear is reserved instances. Reserved instances are essentially contracted for a longer period, maybe 1, 3, or 5 years. We're going back to our original conversation in the last section. You know, basically a customer or an enterprise is guaranteed availability, capacity, and reusage of these pre-purchased reserved instances, right? Now, the benefit of this is that the cloud providers can get discounts on these resources, right? Big discount periods, maybe you get 30 off, 40 off, whatever, right? Over these long periods. But this also is very cost efficient, right? So this is a great way, good way to set budget control, right? A company will know exactly what the costs are for that period and so on. And the goal is to do constant optimization of this, right? And so on. So it's a little less flexible than pay as you go model, but more importantly, it requires that upfront payment of investments and so on. So then it goes back to your accountant. For those of you on the finance side, is you have to think about how working capital gets tied up and so on. So those are some of the things. The next one is dynamic provisioning, right? So with dynamic provisioning, one of the things that we discuss is it's more of an automated process, right? For example, hey, I have a web server that experiences a spike in load. Hey, it's the holiday season now, right? You're a giant, big e-commerce retailer. So now your cloud provider will automatically deploy more resources to that web server or pool, and those extra resources will be billed on a pay-as-you-go model, right? And so on. So that's basically the example here. Now, there are many examples here. I won't belabor the point here, but I'm showing an example of Azure does it, right? They use something called the Azure Resource Manager, or ARM. It's the arm that controls Azure, right? So, um, so Azure works with sort of the Azure Resource Manager, and this is a service that handles requests from users and makes sure that the requests are fulfilled, right? So the request is basically sent to ARM. Basically, every time you click on something on Azure portal, it goes to ARM, right? And ARM is basically what executes all the actions. It deploys the VM, it assigns memory, processor, all of those changes happen through ARM. Now, ARM can either be directly accessed by developers who love to access it through PowerShell or command line interfaces, or in some cases, you can even go to an SDK, like a software development kit. And so SDKs are simply libraries with scripts and code templates that are called through a command in the PowerShell or CLI, right? And so on. So this is sort of a conceptual diagram of ARM. Goal is just to give you an idea of how everything works. Now, this also, there's also similar native tool in AWS, right? AWS has AWS OpsWorks stacks for the deployment of resources. It basically works like a cookbook repository. It's a term AWS has borrowed from another infrastructure tool called Chef. So, you understand, it makes sense if you know what works under the hood, you'll be able to build that in. So these are, again, automation tools and processes. Now, with in AWS, the stack itself is a core component of any deployment in AWS. It's simply the construct that holds the different resources, such as EC2, VMs, and Amazon RDS, right? RDS is short for Relational Database Services or database instances. So OpWorks basically sits on top, make sure that these resources are grouped together in a logical way, then deployed as a logical group. And we call this a cookbook or recipe, and so on. So it's important to remember that Stacks works in layers. The first layer is the ELB, right? The elastic load balancing layer. It sort of holds the load balancer. The next layer hosts the sort of the VMs, the actual servers that are deployed from EC2. The third layer is the database layer. So if the stack is deployed, you can basically add the application from a different repository and so on. So OpWorks can do this automatically as soon as servers and databases are deployed, or can be done manually, right? So that's sort of the example here. We also have something similar in GCP here. Give me a second here. I'm just going through it. So don't want to jump too ahead. Okay. So GCP uses what they call Deployment Manager, right? So it's basically a native programmatic deployment mechanism tool. Basically, we can create resources, group them logically together in a deployment instance, and basically all of this happens in a YAML. It's coded in a YAML file, right? That's what I'm showing here, and the deployment is ready. We can then deploy this to GCP. There's a command interface. Basically, the YAML file will help you specify the resource, meaning it'll give you the machine type, it'll give you the image family, which is the operating system, the zone, meaning the zone in which in GCP where the resource will be deployed, what type of root persistent disk, right? Specifies the boot sequence of that resource, and obviously an IP address, right? And so all of this is stored in that YAML file that is deployed by the deployment manager, and so on. So this is sort of the big picture around, all these tools. Again, if you're very interested in learning more about these tools, if you want to see maybe a great webinar around these, do give us a ring. We'd love to hear from you and think about, you know, some of the guidelines around, how to go about procuring this. Anyway, so I just wanted to, um, sorry, give me a second here. I jumped too ahead again. Okay, there you go. So if you want to set up some guidelines around this, how to set guidelines and principles for provisioning, very simple is you can actually leverage each of them have their own pricing calculators, right? Azure has one. And you basically look up the pricing calculator, look up the specific resource. Let's say it's a virtual machine. You switch it on, you open it up, you look at all the various things. You know, all of these pricing calculators, they have a naming convention. So you have to familiarize yourself with the naming convention. You'll see, hey, is it 50 gigs? It is 2 CPUs or 3 vCPUs or virtual CPUs? Is it 8 gigs of RAM, 16 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of RAM? What's the operating system? Where is it being deployed, right? What region? Which region is closer to my services for my customers? All of that. Am I buying monthly? Am I buying pay as you go? Am I buying 1 year, 2 year, 3 year reserved instances? All of those will come into play, and so on. So those are sort of the big piece around that. Again, if you're really interested, we have for our cloud technology coaching on this. If you're interested, or if you're looking for some help around that, we can definitely help out with some of that. Um, the next piece is around validating and managing. Oops, validating and managing bills. And this is sort of a dreaded thing, like back in the old days of cloud, we used to dread getting our bill every month. Is it, we'd even have like a little game we'd play, like, is it double of what we spent last month, or is it half of what we spent last month? Somebody would go in, and obviously that's not the right approach to do it, right? So you want to make sure that we learn how to view and analyze costs from our respective consoles within Azure, AWS, and GCP, right? As an example. So basically, each of these uh, clouds have their own, um, own way of doing out their cost dashboards, right? So one of the things is, Microsoft have their own billing service, right? And you can sort of look at under cost management and billing in the Azure portal. That's the service blade that you can switch on. And so Azure Billing has basically three types of billing. There's Microsoft Online Services Billing. This is basically every user in Azure starts in this program. As soon as you sign up to Azure through a portal, you will get a billing account. In some cases, you can sign up for the free account or trial period, or when the trial period ends, you can jump to a pay-as-you-go model, and so on. They used to make subscription to Visual Studio. They used to price you for that, but now, thank you, Microsoft, for making Visual Studio free for the whole planet. That's great. So, um, and then enterprise agreements. That's typically what most organizations will do is they'll sign an EA agreement with Microsoft to use Azure. And this has been there even before cloud. This has sort of been the traditional way of how enterprises buy from Microsoft, right? It basically comes preloaded with all the products and services. There's basically a monetary commitment, and then the organization is entitled to extensive support. But then once a year, Microsoft will send an auditor in to make sure that you're spending at least the minimum. And if you've gone over, you pay for the difference as well. The final one is the Microsoft Customer Agreement. This is when an organization sort of signs up for Azure. In most cases, a billing account will be issued for a Microsoft Customer Agreement, but in some Azure regions, a Microsoft Customer Agreement will be issued if a free account is being upgraded, right? So all of these are some examples of that. Again, this is sort of giving you guys a hands-on. This is mostly for my finance and accounting peeps here that, folks that really is maybe the first time you're looking at it. It's okay. Don't cry. We'll take you through that step. Again, it's just a great tool to get access to manage costs. AWS also does the same. There's a free tier for a typical entry point for companies that's looking at it, and so on. So this is sort of, all of them have sort of their, Google has it. Google's GCP is really interesting, is that, you know, as soon as the billing is activated in GCP, the portal will prompt the user to set up a billing account. And once that billing account is associated, it tells you what to associate, which projects, which is the equivalent of subscriptions in Azure or accounts in AWS. And like in Azure, the billing account is coupled with Google Payments profile. So make sure your Google Payments is active. And, I know sometimes like if the name is not matching the credit card, it creates problems. So, that's a big thing. There's basically a billing account admin. This is basically someone who, from this finance team, can view all the costs, set budgets, set billing alerts, link or unlink projects, right? So that's sort of the enterprise level view. Then you have billing account user. This is the only thing the user needs to do is simply link a project to a billing account and see the costs associated. The user can't unlink the project. Um, Only the admin can. So that's something to look at. Um, And then finally, we're looking at sort of validating invoices. So again, this is basically, again, 101 kind of best practice. You want to make sure that what the cloud provider has charged you for is the correct amount. I know cloud providers are fully automated and there's telemetry and all of that, but then you want to make sure that if there are multiple bills, there's no overlap. You want to bring in proper project control, a project manager, product owner, or scrum master. You want to build in some level of architect. So the architect will verify that the resources are agreed upon artifacts from the original design. And then finance and accounting are providing your basic financial checks, and so on to ensure there's, invoices, payment terms, things like that. All of these are actually part of the bigger governance model laid out in CAFs, right? Cloud Adoption Frameworks. So, I really encourage you to look at that. And finally, I want to discuss centralized billing. For a lot of you folks, big fans of multi-cloud, you know, what if I have a multi-cloud environment where I have workloads in two different clouds and we want to know our costs? We don't want to log into multiple consoles to find out what that invoice looks like at the end of the month. Well, there are tools out there called cloud management platforms, or CMPs, right? There's a couple of tools. An example here I'm showing you is Flexera's Optima, right? This is basically a tool. It collects costs from different clouds and presents them in one overall dashboard. The cost can be viewed per category, such as VMs or databases. It can have both daily or monthly reports and so on. And then there's obviously other tools like VMware's Cloud Health, Fujitsu's Pico, and so on, right? And that's basically it. Um, Last but not least, um, I want to jump to sort of the principles of FinOps. You know, now FinOps is a huge topic, as I mentioned, right? This is sort of when you think about all the elements that go into this, you know, we have to look at optimization from a whole perspective, right? So there's optimize, understand what do I need to turn off, what do I need to turn on. When you start on your cloud journey, you're basically, you have to start small and then basically go back and reconfigure, and so on. It's kind of like, you bake cookies every week, right? You're finding the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe, and then I can get the smell from the kitchen here. So you want to keep tuning all the ingredients. In this case, you want to make sure, hey, am I using all my reserve instances? Am I right sizing it? Have I put in enough automation? Am I catching unused resources? Am I placing the workloads in the right regions, low cost regions? Some of those things. And then there's the operate. As I'm operating that, does all my teams know, my DevOps team, my procurement, my finance, are we all working together, building that with single culture? Do we understand our unit economics, speed of delivery? Are we delivering value to the business? And then inform, which is basically leveraging the tools I mentioned on to basically optimize further and then operate further, right? So it's basically a cycle on this. There's a FinOps Principles that was created by, this is inspired from AWS. They were one of the first cloud providers to create FinOps Principles. And basically, this is sort of high level where we're talking about, hey, I want to build sort of, we cover all of this. This is a great summary for our webinar today as we look at all the elements of, hey, with FinOps, it's all about driving business value. And as a team, we need to bring everybody together, both tech teams, finance, and procurement. We need to ensure that business value is how we drive these decisions. Everybody takes ownership, some level of accountability of their cloud usage, and there is strong governance around that. And that's where we bring in both the office of the project manager, the architects, as well as finance and accounting folks. And then how do we create those reports on a monthly, on a daily basis, or even weekly basis? And really, we should have like a dedicated team looking at FinOps, right? And that's the real role innovation that's happening within accounting, finance groups, where they'll have some folks that that will wear some of that FinOps hat and so on. And again, the goal is to optimize the cloud. And so every year, what I've noticed, great companies, and I've seen it for two of my past clients, is that every year their cloud consumption goes down. And the reason is they've been deploying FinOps without even knowing FinOps is in place, right? So that's the key piece. Again, if you're very interested to learn more about this, we can definitely reach out to us at we'll help you out with sort of the technology coaching piece. You have myself and our group of great, even more smarter people that's available to help out with your organization needs, to help on, and even to enable your organizations. How do you get this message to your tech teams, to your procurement teams, to your finance teams, and so on? So with that, I don't have any further questions. Check out Cloud Institute, our website, and the link below. Any questions before we disembark? I'll be here for a few minutes. No questions? Great. I want to thank you for joining our webinar session today. This webinar will be recorded and made available to you as soon as the recording has been complete. Without further ado, thank you everyone for attending, and have safe holidays and trip. And I hope I hope to see all of you next year. Good luck on the holiday shopping out there, and catch you later on the next one. Take care.